Man, this recording is, it needs really to be more prepared before I do this. And I don't like saying, I don't like, it, in some sense, this directly corresponds to one of the subject matter that Richard Grannon was talking about with his friend. This is so embarrassing that I don't know both of their names. I must say, I don't watch the, whatever it's called, Tentacle something, the podcast. Um, but it looks like a very nice dynamic. I must say, it slightly annoys me when they get into very deep topics. Man, this is such a horrible thing to air this kind of comment, but because for me that it's a bit too simplistic. It's a bit too generalized. It's a bit too sort of imprecise, and I think that they kind of. And I mean, maybe it's just because I develop, even just by hearing these topics, I develop a more particular, kind of version of, what really the problem is. And I think that they're kind of overshooting it and they're generalizing it a bit too badly. Like, let me go into a specific example. So, Richard Grannon says that all social media is toxic because your brain is not evolved for it. And yeah, I mean, like roughly that is actually correct in some way. I think the thing that is toxic about the internet and about these things is that it's all about the curatorship. It's all about the suggestion feed. That's the toxic part of YouTube. It's not. It's the going in, being sucked into the rabbit hole, which Richard Grannon himself even specifically describes this essentially as being the problem. This was not a problem originally on YouTube because YouTube itself did not, you know, I think you would only see videos that were like in a kind that were directly related to the video. Like there weren't people that like this video also like that video that's being suggested to you. It was like literally on the topic. So you were searching for a target. You had something on your mind that you were looking for. You found it, or you found a video that then gave you a suggestion to another video that was on the same topic. And so you wouldn't get off topic. You wouldn't get derailed. You wouldn't get hijacked. Wouldn't limbically hijacked or whatever. And in some sense, whether you were able to find something that interested you had to do, well, were you in the right social circle? Were you in the right network? Were you in the right social network? Did you have your friend give you a suggestion? Did you have someone tell the curatorship? It's the curatorship function that we outsourced to the platform, to the ether. That is the kind of the culture, the toxic culture of being hijacked, as it were, and then being sort of wrestled about in the tide of controversy and but people have a natural inclination towards controversy, and I'll tell you why. Is because conflict is the precursor to resolution or to and people, there's a undergirding this, let's say, lowest common denominator generalization and tendency for people to revel in tearing people apart and whatever. Well, it's because in contestation, in the contest of ideas, uh, uh, there is something worthy to be cut out. There is something worth understanding about what makes something better than something else. Now, again, I think that this issue is then doubled down into a further generalization of Eastern Yin religion and spirituality and philosophy is simple and it's better essentially than the complexity of the Yang language content, kind of. Now, I understand that there's something certainly true about within this kind of motif that they are drawing out, but they are overshooting it horribly and they are drowning the baby in the bathwater kind of thing. Or that's I don't. It annoys me because and talking about Eastern. I mean, okay, this is going to make me sound like a pompous and conceited person, but there's a lot of complexity in Eastern religion. Like just because it's not. I think it's being horribly misrepresented, but I mean, well, Taoism, the Tao which has no name, how that is described and imparted to people as this kind of ephemeral thing, which is, yes, it is maybe closer to kind of axiomatic knowledge and understanding, that it can't be argued because it's a kind of, well, you choose your assumptions and then that is how you enter the world, and or in terms of how you enter it through accessing it through a mental vehicle that is not. It's always hard to describe these things, which is why it's usually done through some kind of poetry when you describe an analogy of the Tao that cannot be named, um, and then you say that the eternal Tao is beyond it, or whatever. But um, now I think that there are some problems with some of these modalities and things like that, because um, Eastern religion, although I'll say does have a piece of the puzzle, as it were, it's not properly integrated. And as if there weren't syntheses, like I would say that the kind of um, the Greek religion, as it were, in its kind of, if you, I mean, this is perhaps a revisionist reading of some of these things, but explicitly we know that there are many people that believe that the gods were a kind of anthropomorphized, sort of pantheon of their own internal archetypes, which has this. Anyway, I mean, the Oracle of Delphi, know thyself. Man, I always forget the whole phrase. Is know thyself. Yeah, it doesn't just say know thyself. It says know thyself, and you will know the gods and the universe. So perfectly encapsulated. The microcosm is a model of the macrocosm. Okay, these things are somewhat reflections of each other, but they also need to be held as perhaps distinct categories so that we don't confuse ourselves in an oversimplification. Um, I think that those kind of categorical distinctions are being played with a little bit fast and loose, on the Tentacle podcast. I can't remember its proper name. Anyway, but the simplicity that they're talking about, which is, you could say something is like the authenticity of a subjective individual, you know um, well, you still need to learn how to contend with, let's say, the convolution and the complexity of the world, and um, not be covered in it, to work out how to say. So, and I guess what I'm also outlining is that there is a tremendous, kind of Christian philosophical, spiritual philosophy that I particularly, am a partisan of, that am a believer in, and I believe that it's a perfectly substantiated understanding, and the idea that you can, anyway, I do think that there's this modern trend to not have an understanding, and that, you just kind of have these, you have this loose bundle of truisms, this loose bundle of good phrases and useful things, and you can just kind of always, but is it an understanding? Does it conform to an understanding that you actually stand on, and that, and that stands over you, in that you are a slave to your own understanding, that it actually has a compulsive force against you? Or can you just rearrange the loosely associated good phrases and jumbled, fragments, and then you can just kind of, it leads you to be able to rationalize and to sort of best fit, and fudge your way out of issues. And you can do that when you merely just have simplistic things, because you don't, the mental vehicle of the simple understanding has to actually be something of a rigid filtration system that is coherent and consistent, and that is a little bit complicated. That is, at least uh, it has to be integrated, and it's not easy to integrate that, and you can't just boil it down to basic simplicities and truisms, or something like that. And so I caution against that, and I think that that is perhaps a kind of, that it's not that simple actually, and just saying that it's that simple, it's ephemeral, and you could say it's deeply intuitive, and it's hard to describe, and you might sort of label that as simple, but I don't think it's simple. Um, and it does require something like a mystery story to, and a mystery school even, and something of an education to properly digest. Um, because it's not easy. I mean, this is why there's so many complicated things in a lot of religions, because even if you can boil them down to simplistic motif, this is the point of Christianity. The point of Christianity is that now we're talking about the Trinity, and now we're talking about something else that's in the same religion. Now we're talking about the crucifixion. Now we're talking about something else. We're talking about the Son of God, Jesus Christ. And the Son of God is related to the Word in the Trinity, and it's related to the process of the crucifixion, which is also the process that we must all go through. It is the, sorry, what's the word? Not the word. It's it's like an analogy. This is going to be sacrilegious to some people. This is going to be contravening other people's doctrines that are not my doctrine. But essentially, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ is not a vicarious redemption. It is an example that must happen to you, and you must go through it. And the factual history of it or not is utterly irrelevant, because it must be your spiritual truth that you can confess, because you can't confess something that happened 2,000 years ago to somebody else. If you try to confess that in court, they will call you crazy or a liar, and they will be true on one of those counts. So don't bring me your simplistic lies or whatever, and then you find a way to fudge whatever you want to fudge, and you can be part of the most magnificent, you know, um, cosmic drama that you can project. And this is just a delusion. These are the scales in your eyes, blah blah blah. But the so it's very easy to you know the the scriptures are the spiritual truth. They're not the worldly truth. They are communicating spiritual things. They're not communicating worldly things. When Jesus Christ is born of a virgin, like, this is not a natural description of the natural world. This is a spiritual description of the spiritual world. I mean, even in James, the genealogy of Jesus Christ is given as his and Joseph is in the lineage, his father. So, you know, there's I mean, so that's sacrilegious to some people, because they don't have spiritual ears to hear, and they don't have a spiritual understanding that they care about. They just want something else. They want magic tricks. They want magic shows, and they want the simplicity of magic. So anyway, this might look. I'm broadening the topic. Let me not put this at the feet of Richard Grannon. This is just a stepping stone for me to make a broader point and teaching and polemic, perhaps. But so the point that I just want to make is that the reason why we have these mystery stories and the mystery is because it's very complicated, and you're not going to understand the philosophy all at once. So we break it down into fragments, because now we can talk about what is God, what is the Trinity, and then we can talk about the crucifixion, and we can talk about other things, and they have separate compartments that can be understood until it actually comes knocking on your door, and you open the door, and it's Jesus Christ, and the door is open now, but not the door that was the door inside the door. How you can hear the truth now for yourself. So the truth comes knocking, and can you hear it? And if you can hear it, then you always had it. So it's a bit of a paradox, self-realization. because you have to realize that you were self-unrealized. That's what you suffer from, is a form of self-unrealization, that you unlock it through a kind of mental gymnastics to some degree. But it's not a anyway, the actual real solution to the mental problem, the simultaneous mystery of life, which is, so I'm using the word mystery a lot. I don't want to get semantically confusing people, but I mean the problem is that the mind is not the solution, but it is the vehicle. It is the container for something, and you need it to represent. You need your vehicle to represent your spirit and your spiritual wisdom, as it were, and your ideal cultivation and responsibility to certain ideals, and you need to monitor how you're doing that through what your mind is doing. So you need a clear filter. You need a transparency in the mind, but you need it to actually filter things out. Um, And so you need a duty, you need a spiritual responsibility, you need to be yoked, as it were. You need to be yoked by your own mind, and that is the understanding. It says in the scripture, do not lean on your own understanding. That doesn't mean that you are not captive to your own understanding. It means don't make it do work for you, essentially. And it's very problematic because it's also has to be some kind of double-edged sword. It has to cut both ways. Also, it says in the scripture, does not say in the scripture to not judge. It says, judge not lest ye be judged. It doesn't say do not judge. It just says that the judgment is double-edged, as it were. And so you need a duty, you need something to do that is going to be the vehicle, the criteria, the border, the periscope, the lens through which your mind can uh, be part of the process. And yes, you can always ask, well, why do you hold that value? Why do you hold that value? Why? Why is this the truth? And you don't, at some point, you can't, it will go on forever. And the only way to stop that is via negativa. And you say, well, I might be wrong. Do you have a better way? That's the divine excuse. That's but as it were, and that I'm saying with a lot of irony, because it's not an excuse. It's a hard won thing that uh, you have to turn over that stone. But and it's not so much an excuse or a permission slip or something like that. That is the actual true limit of individual integrity, that is both integrity and humility, that is actualized by the mind. And so it is the caveat against the spiritual integrity that you might claim. And it also holds you into a responsible cultivator of life, of tending to the living and not to the hypothetical, not to the abstract, not to the, some kind of infinite regress that you get to pretend like it's supporting you. Um, so just because you might be wrong doesn't mean that you believe that you are wrong. And so your belief has a fundamental sense of integrity, of self-awareness that's sort of built into it, and then the fallibility of living in the world, of making mistakes that are not the same thing as errors, that one capable of making mistakes, but not error prone. That is the higher, that's understanding that yes, we have an earthen vessel, but we have the contents of which is of a higher quality, and those of the world will not hear, and those who are of God, who have the same God, have the same Father, uh, who are chosen of that calling. So that's the distinction there, and I mean, you see, there are also other details to the mental filter. What I'm sorry, this is the topic that I'm trying to get into, is describing the actual content of the mental filter, and I'll tell you another great secret I think of the mental filter is that you have to have a unilateral filter. It has to be a solitary measure, which essentially, I mean, in a generalized way, I'll call it via negativa, in a principled way, but in a substantiated form, there is a perfect one that you can find in the Hindu scripture, which is, I think, almost, this is slightly insulting to say, it's maybe the only, because of how it's phrased in the Hindu scripture, it comes out in a way that is harder to distort than in the Christian scripture, where the same message, the same teaching has been distorted by false religion for so long, which is the love everyone as you love yourself. In the Hindu scripture, it says the spiritual, it's phrased in the negative. It's phrased as a negative duty. It says, do not create unwanted population. Now, if you can, maybe you can trace the convergence of the things that I'm drawing together here. Do not create, I mean, this is maybe a bit of a secret, which is better when one derives oneself in the quest of introspection and meditation and the search for the true name of love. Then you work out this duty in one's mental filter, that is how you love your neighbor as you love yourself, is that you do not do those things which will lead towards unwanted population. And then you have a worldly translation of the bounds of the spiritual gift, the limits of the spiritual gift, as it were, the field within which, that the reason why you can, I mean, and you can even say that this was the overarching moral precept which is hidden in the wrath of the God of the Old Testament, to do these things and to not do these other things, and to follow these very particular instructions, and to go and smote a nation in this way, and to go and uh, uh, do this to another people in this particular form of is that the morality here: do not create unwanted population, because their form of morality, their form of culture, it is ungodly, it is unholy, it is it is a vector of both spoiling, not just for themselves, but also for their influence that they might have on others. There was uh, anyway, I don't want to get too much into this, but this has to do with the themes of the origin of himself. Abraham came from Sumer, was because they actually found the true God in their blood magic and their religion of looking under, um, within the contents of what's going on, what's the truth in this blood, what's how. Anyway, I don't want to get, this is going to get too occultish and esoteric and weird and stuff, but and there was, let's say, history, that there was spiritual progress that needed to happen, there was digestion that needed to happen within the blood, I would say, is and the kind of cultivation that the Spirit of God uh, uh, was performing on His people, or whatever. Anyway, the I don't want to open up this can of worms. It's because I don't like talking about this in this kind of narrative framework. It's very poisonous. It's anti-spiritual, in fact. That kind of fatalistic sort of thing, and uh, or it has fatalistic overtones, which are very spiritually. Anyway, sorry. Let me just jettison that whole thing. That requires its own very delicate way of tending to those component elements and things. But uh, unwanted population. It is the subtlest thing that can create unwanted population. Uh, I mean, the Gita itself talks about the terrible sort of thing about creating a bad example. This has been slightly revised as we have progressed, I would say, since that time, in that the emphasis on individual discerning and spiritual discerning has meant that everything becomes food. Everything becomes a potential spiritual food. That the bad example is also a useful ingredient to at least a mind that is, seeking. And in some sense, then the worst thing is that, well, people know that they've been taught that by their tradition, by their culture, so they say, yes, I am seeking, I am seeking, but instead they're just searching for a mix-up. They say, well, I'm searching the word because, and they're looking in something called a Bible, and the written word is dead in there, but they say this is the word, and so they've lost the meaning of something, and then they can play an entire trick on themselves. And that's the level of error, and the level of the repromulgation of error, is that you have lots of people that are stuck into these kinds of cults and ruts, and that are based on these kinds of equivocations, the semantic equivocation that allows them to have a loosely association of goodly looking nice things that they lay claim to conserving, if only they can fend off the kind of the sloppy divide that they have to, the fuzzy line in the sand that helps them have continued access to the good things, so long as the fuzziness of the line keeps the bad things cordoned away from it. And this is not discerning. And there might, this, it has to be refined. It has to look for real substantiation. And at some point, there is this is the beginning of the 1,000 years. When you're at this point, this is the beginning of the 1,000 years, and you can say, "Oh, but I've been through so much. I've surfed these turbulent seas, and I've made my way in the world, and I've seen things, and I've seen through things." And now you say, I must be victim to Satan for 1,000 years of thinking again on everything from nothing to build a slow, beleaguered construction of something that might last forever and only be complete at the end of 1,000 years. To see what isn't carried away by the tide. And the turning out of your own, the having to steel man your own position when your own internal intelligence and barometers are playing devil's advocate against yourself in the via negativa of hating your mother and your father and your brother and your sister and your own life to be worthy to be a disciple. And those who love their lives, and wish to save them will lose them, and those who are willing to lose their lives will save them. That's the meaning. And the kingdom of God was always at hand, but only those who did not wish to go through the ardor of the 1,000. Revelations was always at hand. The revelation of God, this is always been at hand. At whose hand? At your hand, the hand of the individual. I mean, look, I don't want to be too instructive, because maybe I don't know where you are. Ideally you'd have a functioning communion, a functioning church, and I shouldn't be saying these things so flagrantly, perhaps, that it's a terrifying thing to give real doctrine to people who are not in a position to take proper edification of it, because they are the world has them in other ways, perhaps. But anyway, in terms of this I think is this is my understanding. And I should be careful about this, because it has some people, very few people are perhaps capable of doing this themselves, of being something like a one-man church. And it might very well be not very much not possible for many people, that they do need an actual communion. Um, so, I mean, look, this is a complicated topic. I think I'll just leave it at that. That's what I wanted to say. But I do, when I look at compromise, or when I look at things that are suboptimal, I I can't hold my tongue, I guess, is the thing. Although, I'm not offering a practical alternative, I'm offering what I think is at least the model of the real solution, as it were. Um, at least to have people know in their minds that there is something else to be sought, or there is something uh, greater to aim for, and that it should not be relegated to myth or mythology. It's but a mystery, and the mysteries of God shall be finished. That is what it says in Revelations. Anyway. Oh, and yeah, I should finish off the point that I was making about one of the points, the earlier points that I first mentioned about what Grannon said. So I do think that there is a way to make the internet more human again, and I think that if look, this is a bit of a this requires a bit of changing of things, but essentially, if someone would create a portal for YouTube, where you would, instead of having a YouTube account, you would have an account for this portal, and would be like a client that had YouTube inside of it, and it would basically curate YouTube for you, in that it would remove the curatorship. Is a bit of a oxymoron here. The point of the curatorship of this client is that it would remove what YouTube has done to make it into a rabbit hole. And so, if you wanted to be exposed to things on YouTube, you would actually have to select those curating services, or not services, but like a curating um, and because that would change the nature of how things were spread now, because it's like the algorithm doesn't suggest something to you, you have to go and make a connection to the thing that is going to make the suggestion for you to consume. So either you have to sign up to your own newsletter that's going to give you curated suggestions, or so then at least you can say, well, I like this newsletter, or that newsletter is better than this newsletter. I like how someone has organized this newsletter of suggested content, and then you actually have to make the connection of signing up to that newsletter and knowing what the character of that newsletter is. I think that what has made the current state so toxic is because the source of the curatorship is shadow, is phantom, is kind of, it's not accessible, it's not on display. And so the suggestion is coming from the ether, and this, I think, is the really toxic. That's the kind of the inception into fatalism. That's the inception into the narrative of the world right there. It's like being vortexed into a pool of darkness. There's no reason there. It's not visible. It's just an abyss that captures all light. And if you try to, you can't be friends with something that is fundamentally darkness, that is the love of not understanding. That's what the darkness is the love of not understanding. And so if you want to revel in that, oh yes, the algorithm gave me cool suggestions, you're reveling in your not understanding, because it's not visible. The name of the algorithm is not visible. The algorithm maybe changes, maybe it's in terms of the criteria, it doesn't have stable inputs. It has inputs that are aggregated purely from collective statistical, kind of um, uh, uh, conflations. It's pseudo understanding. It's conflated. I mean, it is almost the spirit of equivocation. It is the spirit of surrender to the narrative. It is fundamentally it's almost like the spirit of man, and it is fundamentally dehumanizing. And it will, the more that people try to rationalize profiting from it or being supplied by it, the more they are entreating themselves into a kind of corruption. And I think that is the corruption. It's not a corruption, it's the suggestion function, as it were, that is the problem. It's the veil over the curating aspect to it that makes it fundamentally, it's a kind of infantilism. It's a kind of paternalism right there. You are being infantilized by the platform when it is curating things in the shadows for you. And if you learn to love that, then you must be a corrupt miscreant. I think that there's no way around that, because you have given up your understanding. You have forsaken your own understanding, and the heart is not the feelings. The heart is the heart of understanding, and so you have your heart is the heart of darkness, is the love of the darkness. It's the love of not understanding. It's the opposite of real love. And that is really what it all comes down to. And you can see that when people love the darkness, they have to gravitate towards some kind of I mean, it's a very kind of empty, hollow sort of thing, and they almost have to agitate themselves because they have to get drunk on the wrath of the fornication with their love of the darkness. They have to they have to agitate themselves even to make themselves feel something about the thing that they continue to double down into. That's how self-destructive it is, essentially. Okay, so that I think is the stuff. What should I say? Yeah, so I think that if we had platforms that respected this, and that the only suggestions that you received were suggestions of direct content pertinence, but not just associations of, oh well, you like this, other people, you should also maybe like this because of conflating you with other people. I think that is the root of the toxicity, as it were. Um, and then look, they're anthropomorphic. Sorry, they're a- anthropological sort of aspects. As I don't want to give a sort of a sociological breakdown, but I'll just, yeah, no, I think I do. This point came up while I was discussing this with Black Wolf, and I, I I made this point, and I think it is an important point to understand about our times, is that, in the 90s, we really did have morality correct. In the 1995, we had proper morality. We had non-racialism. If people had just stuck to that course, we would be in a much better world with much more responsible politics, accountable leadership. But, things have gotten really crazy in terms of, um, the climate alarmists, always trying to create a kind of systemic inception into the narrative. So you just go with the flow, and that you'll take on the label of some category, and that you will just fall in line and follow the program. That you become diminutive to the cosmic morality and the narrative that you don't understand, but you just have to be on the right side of, or something like that. The right side of the mob is the kind. But there's also another element to this, which is that, I mean, I don't think that this was just produced by the tendency of oligarchy within corrupt systems of power. This wasn't just an invented ideology, that there is something in people that I wonder if this isn't a cycle that has continued in earlier generations, where people have had the right morality about something, but it's been broken because of the new generation. Because I do think that there are new generations that come up, and every new generation wants to create a counterculture and a subculture, because when you are growing up, you are in the minority by definition of your age cohort. When you're in high school, the rest of society is above you, and they're more than you, and they're already established. And you have nothing, you're in high school. So what you have, I would say that there's going to be a tendency towards trying to create some kind of subculture, some kind of secret handshake and a wink and a nod, so that you can rely on a kind of camaraderie, a kind of solidarity with your cohort of your generation to help as a way to access and to secure, as a kind of network, as like a as like a it's like a security blanket. And so there's every incentive to develop a counterculture that has a kind of that has its apologists, or that has its intellectuals, that explains why the last generation got it wrong and we got it right, and we are more sophisticated, intelligent than them, so we should scorn them and we should promote ourselves, and we should help each other because they don't have it right, and we are better than them, we understand it better than they do. So there is that, and usually there is something bad about the last generation. There is something to be refined about the last generation. There is something that they got it wrong. But the problem is that the 90s morality had it right. They had everything right. They had morality correct. And so to do this, you actually have to go against morality. And if you have to go against real morality, you can't just go against it. If you are defaming the truth, you can't just skew it. You have to go 180 degrees. You have to go fucking fascist. And that's what we've got. We've got a cohort of moral reprobates. We've got miscreants of the highest degree. We've got morally destitute, morally bankrupt people who wanted a kind of implement of self-aggrandizement. They wanted to construct their, because not only did this moral paradigm of the 90s is a threat to having a kind of a really good cohort secret handshake, but that it also was a bar against toxic individuals from being able to orchestrate their social manipulation. It stopped the borderline personality disordered people from being able to set up their narrative grifting and their sympathy extraction and their manipulative social politics, which always depends on outgroups. That non-racial, the values and morality of non-racialism and non-sexism, the values of the Bill Cosby show, had to be pulled apart and debased and they had to be tarred, and they couldn't even do it because it's so hard to do that. So they had to redefine the word semantically. They had to invent convoluted new moral buzzwords, and they had to repeat them so often that they lost their meaning, so that then they could be woven into a narrative web and that's, and I'm just trying to say that this is not I don't think that we suffer from a conspiracy from oligarchs. This is the human condition that we are fighting with. It is the culture itself, the tendency in the culture itself to have these cycles of this leviathan of to go back to the sea, to the tumult, to the crofts and the treffs, the troughs and the crests of an always oscillating cycle of chaos and drama, because that gives them the cover and the space to indulge in their own kind of games on a small scale. Because if you don't have an outgroup that you can just divert pressure onto, it's very hard to set up social manipulation. It's very hard to do that unless you can find an excuse to have an arbitrary distinction between an outgroup. And so these people, they converted non-racialism into a dogma of anti-racism so that they could invest in the same kind of morality, blackmail, and hostage taking, and constructing reality tunnels, and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, I'm not going to go too much into it, but so there was a great individual proclivity to find a chink in the armor of, and they couldn't even find one. I would say they have not corrupted the morality of the 90s. All they can do is malign it. All they can do is create propaganda and slews of it. They have to create so much of it. They have to put it on the loudspeaker. They have to cram it down your throat. They have to impose it by authoritarian measure. That is the corruption that we are up against. But anyway, but I just wanted to say that this is not, I don't blame elites for this. I blame the human condition and psychology for this. Is not the elites that have done this to us. It is the morality and culture, and and this, also, you can't have a state-led culture, and if people and I think we just need to start taking culture seriously. And my solution is just to segregate from these people. We say, no, we don't like your morality. You are sick. We don't want you part of this institution. You're not welcome here. Our prerogative is that we don't, unless you're willing to understand that you, there's something really strange about your morality, and you want to change your ways, you actually don't have the moral upstanding integrity needed in order to be part of our culture. And so, we might be able to live in the same democracy as you, and hopefully it'll survive your fascism, and hopefully we can get our act together to kind of create a nice fence. Fences make good neighbors, as they say, or something like that. But we need to start working on the fence, and some and not go and provoke them, and not go and engage with them, but to do real pragmatic work in literally just diverging from them in a functional way, so that we don't have to be beleaguered by their war of attrition, because their whole worldview doesn't even work in principle. It's not worth arguing against. It's a fake argument. You really are taking the bait if you think that you're having an argument with them. That's not what it's about. It's just about tarring you with their labeling system that validates their narrative, because that's all they can do is repeat the loudspeaker of their narrative. And there's no integrity, there's no individual locus of control. They just have all the good words. They've just labeled all the nice things that they associate with themselves. But anyway, this is somewhat. There are a lot of issues around here that are in my other recordings, but that's enough. Anyway, look, I mean, obviously, you can't. In some situations, I don't imagine that people should kill themselves to try to stand out and rebel. I do think that one should make the intelligent rebellion that one is capable of making and slowly move towards this kind of solution that I'm proposing, which is that we set up organizations or institutions that apply pressure to reform structure, or at least to clean up structure, or at least to create alternative facilities that keep themselves, that have a filter built into, so that they don't get corrupted in the same way and they don't get influenced by the creeping authoritarianism and fascism. That's basically it, is just intelligently move to defend and move to defend the fence, and first establish the fence, establish a defendable fence in law, in using, like that requires some coordination. That'll be the biggest culture war victory possible, because then you'll actually have you'll have something permanent that isn't in the air, that you're not constantly trying to fight over and fight and maintain, is that that it's on your side, that it has real morality and values and principles. And then you can, and then maybe you can see how successful it is, because if it starts becoming successful, then you can expand the model. It can be copied, it can be scaled up. And I think we do need one university that is explicitly anti-woke, so that it can provide the kind of intellectual support for the rest of people in society, that they can say, well, look, there are other people that make sophisticated arguments that bolster this point. That So it's not just this kind of, because that's mostly how their authoritarianism works, is that they just label you controversial. We need structures that take the heat of the controversy, that say, no, we've got lawyers that have already defended this point, we know how to argue this point, we've developed the legal arguments, and we've got a defendable fence, and then we can actually move to include, or be a model to have more people enjoy that free society, that those liberal values. Anyway, that do so with the conscientiousness that we reject and we repudiate this toxic poison. Because if our culture is capable of doing this, then it's actually capable of owning itself, of owning its own liberty as well, because it's actually won its own liberty, not by some kind of state political solution, but culturally, in some sense, independently of the state. Anyway, I'm somewhat repeating myself, and I could probably condense this into a better kind of way of communicating it, but I mean, I believe that I already practice this on the individual scale. I would just it's a bit harder to do for some individuals to be a walking, talking, sort of ideologue rebuke shop is not easy to do. It would be easier if there were institutions, and the institutions that have been vetted, and that they've got the, yes, well, we come and give your school a rating, and we say, oh, you don't have any disgusting syllabuses, your syllabus of each subject is clean of this, moral filth, and actually teaches proper non-racialist values, not these fake so-called anti-racist, narrative bullshit. And so, that's what we kind of need to clean out these things, so that we're not, that these things are already that there are structures in place, there are modules in place. They've got their race and gender studies, we've got our moral courses that you take that center around non-racialism and individual integrity and accountability. That I think would help the men rights activist people. Then they could just, instead of, they could just go on Twitter, and if two people swipe right or whatever, they can say, well, did you pass this module? Have you passed this online sort of integrity check? Because I'm not going to, I don't want to be involved with with someone who's plugged into a toxic narrative, and disabuse them of all that kind of bullshit. It's kind of, then you actually have a cultural fence. You can say no, 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 and then you can have these modules, and maybe better, more advanced modules after that, or perhaps more basic ones, because some people, they can't pass the test, and then, it's like, you actually have to start humanizing people that, from their disgusting sexualist, highly partisan, prejudiced, kind of projection of group guilt and convenient use of generalizations, which always precipitate cherry-picked, useful accusations and grievances for them to trot out, but they never have to, be representative of their monolith, or it's a very strange kind of double standard. It's a very strange, because that kind of morality is obviously why we can't have relations with other people. It's not possible to have individual association and friendship when you have that kind of toxic morality of judging people by group, caste, and category, and having them have to achieve different morality targets based on their caste system. I mean, it's just utterly dehumanizing and disgusting.